Welcome all. It has been an amazing week, and if you are feeling anything like me, I'm sad that it is almost over, but we've got one more outstanding lineup for you this morning focused on buyouts, really building from many of the themes that we've been drawing together over the course of the week. We've got an action-packed lineup of 5 outstanding presentations, and feel free as you are listening to each one of them to drop your questions into the chat, the Q&A function, or your reflections more broadly into the chat. And our session host, Matthew, will be porting them over to us here in our Zoom, where we will make sure we bring up questions for each speaker individually and at the end for a panel among all of the speakers. We will be kicking off this morning with Elise Zavar from the University of North Texas in the Department of Emergency Management and Disaster Science. Elise's work for quite a while now has been creating foundational understanding of how buyouts actually play out across the United States as a whole. I think one of the few people I know who seems to have visited 10,000 locations where buyouts have occurred. This morning, she'll be talking about the consumption and reproduction of the post-buyout landscape, an analysis of visual culture. Elise, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine, for that very kind introduction. Go ahead and get us started here. So Alex, Sherry, and I have been working in Houston, Texas, and following the expansion of the Harris County Flood Control District's buyout program in the wake of Hurricane Harvey in 2017. And as we've been visiting buyout sites in Houston, we've been observing the buyout landscape. And you notice I kind of changed this. We're going to talk about it as the buyout landscape. And this project has really been born out of those observations and that field work to really understand the narratives embedded in landscapes that have experienced or are in the process of a buyout. So literature has shown buyouts have considerable impacts on relocating households. We've heard that in this conference as well, but they also change the physical and social landscape. And so we approach landscape as a social construct. People shape the land and the land in turn shapes people. Landscapes are not neutral. Rather, they make normative claims, they communicate values, and they also contribute to individual and community identities. So using the Harris County Flood Control District's buyout program, which is one of the oldest in the country and home to the socially and economically diverse metropolitan Houston, we're critically examining the social construction of the buyout landscape to understand how it reproduces social values, especially post-buyout open space has considerable impact on peripheral communities, those living adjacent to the acquired properties. And so understanding the buyout landscape gives us insight into the experience of those living in the periphery who interact and encounter these landscapes every single day. So apologies, this is not the best map, but the green areas are the Harris County prioritized areas of focus for buyouts. And so we focus on these areas plus neighborhoods that had already completed buyouts prior to Harvey. And over the course of 3 site visits from 2017 to 2019, we collected 337 unique photos across metropolitan Houston. And so using a visual methodology to elicit themes, particularly a visual landscape assessment, we started to critically identify narratives that are embedded in those landscapes. As Ode and colleagues suggest, your coding should be derived from the residents and the people who live there and shape that land. And so we have conducted interviews with policymakers and residents. And then I should also acknowledge that the 3 of us also bring to this project our own lenses of seeing buyout landscapes in other places. And so our inductive coding is derived from all of that. And it's a very sophisticated field techniques. This is what a lot of it looked like, is us out in the field taking pictures and images. And when possible, if we ran an interview with a resident, we would also then try and capture the images of their former property. So we'd have both together. I want to start with our findings by acknowledging that we're not just looking at a series of photos of mowed open space or homes in the process of demolition, but rather the buyout landscape as experienced by those on the periphery. Because not everyone participates in a buyout program who is eligible or offered, we're also seeing elements of recovery and other forms of mitigation in these neighborhoods. And so in our methods, we noted landscapes of transaction, like you're seeing on the screen here. So lots of properties for sale. And this house is actually buyout eligible, but was being sold on the open market instead of participating in a buyout program, which of course has other implications. We saw a lot of examples of new construction, of investors rebuilding. This is a neighborhood here where it used to be all 1950s era single-story bungalows, and quite a different rebuild for a different socio-demographic coming post-Harvey. And so we observed signs and noted indications for gentrification. And then we also observed land. So this is a park that is a bit of disrepair in a buyout neighborhood. And so we noted all of these along with coding for the aesthetics, actual signs, the text on those, and other iconography of the buyout landscape. And so from that, we've pulled 5 overarching narratives that I'm going to kind of touch on here in the time I have. The first 2 go together. So we have community education and risk communication are 2 narratives embedded in the buyout landscape. So community education, we distinguish as a little bit different than risk communication because its intention is usually more around the physical processes, the physical landscape, in this case, a wetlands, that happen to involve some type of hazard risk. So in this case, flooding. So the sign you're looking at on the left is a kind of education sign about wetlands and the species who live there. And it's in a park that was expanded by a buyout program. And all the features of the park, the playground equipment, are Bayou themed. So you have playground equipment shaped like cypress trees and a river running through it. And so it's really education focused around what would have been in this place had we not developed it for housing and business and human use. On the other picture here you're looking at is an example of risk communication. And this is the first time I've ever seen this. This is a neighborhood where majority of the homes have been bought out. And there's a sign with a number that says, before buying land, call. And you call this number and you get a city representative who will look up the piece of property you're interested in and tell you if it's in a flood zone or not and what flood zone it's in. And so a very overt attempt at trying to dissuade purchasing an investment in a high flood risk area. But at the same time, if you're a resident in this neighborhood, if you're in the periphery, this raises questions about what does it tell you? What do these signs tell you about where you live? You know, that you live in a risky place, a place where you should not be. And how does that shape your experience through navigating everyday activities? And also, how might that inform your willingness to participate in a buyout program in the future? Because we know members on the periphery are often the next potential buyout participants. A couple other themes I'm going to touch on. These were not the most common, but we certainly see buyout landscapes as political propaganda. The logoing and the branding and signs like this that demonstrate your tax money is being put to good use because we are building things to reduce flood risk. And so this also communicates where we decide to put those tax dollars and whose flood risk we're going to reduce. And so it has a lot of social communication around what we value and who we value. And then on the other side of that, there's very, very few examples of commemoration. And the commemoration that is there is typically informal and might not even really appear as commemorative. And so this is a orange tree and just pass by it, might not have much meaning. But I interviewed the former owner of this property, and this orange tree, she requested them not to demolish when they took down the home because her husband and her planted it, and it was a way for her to remember their life in this place before being relocated. And so the lack of commemoration also reveals value about who we deem worthy of remembering and whose experiences we're going to remember and how those are going to be remembered on the landscape. And then the last theme I'm going to touch on here, it was pretty prevalent across Harris County, and that is one of surveillance, and tied into that is issues of access. We saw surveillance kind of at two different levels. We saw the government-led surveillance, so trying to keep people out, reduce illegal dumping, a lot of signage around post-buyout open space properties, excluding people from loitering there. And then we also saw a number of signs from private landowners. And this, I've seen these in places all around the US, but this is unique in that just the sheer volume of them, it was really kind of hit us over the head. And I want to point out here, you have a camera, that's what the red arrow is indicating. It's very overt, but then there's some very nuanced and subtle communications here about who is excluded and who is included. And so you can see the surveillance signs in both English and Spanish. And we saw a lot of private homeowners using signs in both Spanish and English. But then the city sign here in the middle that's aimed at potential property buyers is only in English. And so there's these tacit and kind of subvert indications of who messaging is for and who is welcomed or not. And so to draw some conclusions from this work, and this is ongoing, we're still conducting interviews to also get a better perspective of the residents' consumption of these landscapes. But we see buyout landscapes as a communication tool. These landscapes shape perception on hazard risk, as well as perceptions of crime risk, who's welcomed, who's excluded, whose voices deserve to be remembered, and whose properties deserve to be invested in for flood protection. And all of these narratives have implications for those who live adjacent to the buyout, not just in terms of their house values or their flood risk, but also in terms of their personal and community identities. So constructing where are the safe neighborhoods or the good neighborhoods versus risky or unsafe. And especially we start to think about which neighborhoods or which experiences are worth remembering as people are being relocated and these neighborhoods, these landscapes are changing. This offers some real implications for better understanding those experiences of the people in the periphery. And so I will end there. I'm happy to talk, answer questions, but I just want to say thank you and just also acknowledge my collaborators on this.
Thank you so much, Elise. That was really insightful. And Matthew, are there any questions that have come through in the main system yet?
Not yet. I think we can do the questions at the end, if that's okay.
Well, since she left 3 minutes for questions, I'll throw one out there. I would be really curious to hear how this deep dive, you mentioned, for example, that it was the first time you'd seen risk communication. So compared to your work that's looked at thousands of post-buyout locations, what would you say was the biggest surprise of taking this deep dive, much more, I guess, personal look in a way at the landscape?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, the fact that there's a person whose job is to answer the phone and tell you about the risk, I think is pretty incredible. And so for a lot of communities, especially smaller communities, just don't have the resources available to dedicate that type of personnel and time and energy to mitigating risk in that way. So Houston brings up kind of that other side of the equation where it's a huge city. There are lots of resources. You have a lot of different players and stakeholders in this. The other thing that's just surprising is there are all of these different narratives, despite the fact that the vast majority of the buyouts in Houston are mowed vacant lots. And so it might look like a landscape that we see in many other places. And we know that communities struggle with identifying high utility post-buyout open space for a number of reasons. But even a post-buyout vacant lot is telling us something about those communities. And I think it's important to kind of distill down and understand what those messages are.
We've got one more question that came through. We can take just a minute on this one. How can communities more properly commemorate former residents? How can post-buyout landscapes be more inclusive?
Yeah, so I think really, really good points here and things that academics and practitioners need to wrestle with a bit more is how to remember. So I'm always an advocate for community-led commemoration. It needs to reflect what is therapeutic and beneficial for those who experience the relocation, those who are living adjacent. I'm not suggesting we need to put in a monument in every single open space, but there is a sense of closure for residents who know that their experiences are acknowledged through maybe it's a plaque, maybe it's a Facebook group, maybe people just come together every year and have a cookout on the open space who used to live there. So it needs to be locally driven, but I think there's some opportunities to enhance what we're currently doing in buyout properties.
Thank you. Such a perfect start to our session. And also thank you for leaving time for questions as well.
Yeah, thank you.
We will now shift to Jennifer Niemann, who's a researcher at the University of Miami. And Jennifer's work combines nationwide analysis with very local looks at the theme of retreat and buyouts. And today she will be talking about goals and outcomes of US voluntary buyouts, a systematic comparative analysis. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine, and good morning, everyone. Let me just share my screen and move you all out of the way. All right, so I'm excited to share this research with all of you at this conference, and especially because this has just been a fabulous series of events to be involved in. Every single session I've listened in on has been engaging, informative, and inspiring. So as many presenters have already emphasized during this conference, retreat of some form will become an unavoidable option in many areas of the US. So one such tool for retreat is the topic of this session, voluntary property buyouts. And also, as discussed in several sessions this week, this type of retreat is an extremely complex and challenging adaptation option for communities and governments to implement because there are so many moving parts, such as different levels of government agencies, various sources of funding, and constant and complete community engagement is just a few examples. Now, whether buyouts are the best solution to facing climate change risks is another separate complex question. However, if they are going to take place, it is necessary to fully understand the features that contribute to both the successful programs as well as to the ones that are considered failures, including the goals that led to these programs and the perceived outcomes resulting from these programs. It is also essential to determine who is influencing these goals and who is perceiving these outcomes. So there are two main parts to the presentation that I'll be sharing with you today: a systematic literature review and a comparative analysis with FEMA hazard mitigation assistance data. One of the main objectives of the systematic review was to better understand the multiple and differing objectives stakeholders are trying to achieve through buyouts and what their perceptions of the outcomes are. The comparative analysis then allows us to compare what is covered by the existing literature on property buyouts to what the full FEMA hazard mitigation assistance database tells us. Between the review and comparative analysis, we're able to better find the gaps in what has been studied so far. We can also get an idea of what has been overstudied, which may be an issue if several exceptional cases are then seen to be representative of all buyout programs. So this is a flowchart of our literature search and screening process. We built our library of relevant literature by first searching with Harzin's Publish or Perish searching software to return the most research relevant papers from Google Scholar and Web of Science with this broad, long list of search terms. We then used 2 levels of eligibility criteria for the study selection process. The level 1 screening was performed using Swift Active Screener, a collaborative interactive screening software that uses 2 models to help quickly screen relevant documents. We also used an existing set of literature as a positive seed to aid this screening. The level 1 screening used a broad assessment of each screen paper. Evaluation was done solely on the title and abstract, and a paper was included if the title or abstract included any of these broad terms listed in the left side of this table. A paper was only excluded during the first level of screening if none of these terms were included, if the paper's discussion focused on an area outside of the United States or focused on a hazard that is not flood related. The level 2 screening process was more rigorous, excluding papers that have no specific example of a voluntary buyout project discussed in depth, providing meaningful information. And the information that we were looking for is listed in the left side of this table and includes details such as funding source or amount, size of the buyout program, geography, time frame, methods used when studying the buyout example, actors involved, identified goals, or identified outcomes. If any of these items were included in the paper was then included in our review. If none of these items were included, the paper was excluded. So we ended up with 114 papers that fit all of our criteria. We did include academic as well as non-academic sources such as government or NGO case studies and reports. So this bar graph on the side shows the distribution of locations covered per paper. So the median number of locations per paper is 1 and the mean is 3. We have this major outlier over here that included 129 locations in one document, which was a Fema report of property acquisitions. But more than half of the papers studied only included 1 location per paper. So the data extraction and coding of each paper and location was designed to holistically characterize each buyout example by collecting information about those descriptive aspects laid out in the inclusion criteria, who set what goal for whom, who identifies what outcome as an impact on whom, what categories these goals and outcomes fall into, and how and why these outcomes and goals were able to be completed or not. So going back, I know there's a lot on the screen, but these categories of goals and outcomes, we built a categorization system based on the content of the subset of literature that we had used as our positive seed during the search and screening process. We ended up with 3 levels of categories, with each level getting more detailed and specific. At the first topmost level, which is seen on the leftmost side of these tables, we have 5 main meta categories: buyout process and program implementation in purple, flood risk reduction in blue, governance in orange, social and economic factors in yellow, and environmental influences in green. In order to limit judgment as much as possible, these categories are designed to match the articulation of the goal or perceived outcome as stated in the literature source. The categories are also designed to be independent from one another, meaning that each unique goal and unique outcome is only coded once. So this is a map showing which buyout locations are covered by literature and how many files the location is covered by. We have 194 unique locations represented here. Now, the size of each circle on this map corresponds to how many files the location and its informative details were found in. The majority of the locations, approximately 70%, were covered by just 1 paper. The maximum number of papers that a location was described in was 16, and both Kingston, North Carolina, and Oakwood Beach, New York, were covered in papers this many times. Other locations that were covered extensively, and I'm considering this to be 10 or more papers, include Valmeyer, Illinois, Houston, Texas, Charlotte, North Carolina, Tulsa, Oklahoma, New Orleans, Louisiana, and Grand Forks, North Dakota. So many of these locations could definitely be considered unique locations for one reason or another, because of the creation of local funding mechanisms that don't rely heavily on federal funding, spectacular community support and organization, perhaps the entire town decided to relocate together, or maybe they're a shining example of a buyout program done well, or even because they're case studies of what not to do. These are certainly fascinating case studies to examine, but we may be missing other more representative locations that carried out buyout programs. So our first hypothesis of the literature review was that the goal of flood risk reduction would predominate, especially from government perspectives, as this is in line with legal, regulatory, and programmatic requirements of a voluntary property buyout. The second part of this hypothesis is that many other goals may also motivate property buyouts, and that these goals may differ across various stakeholders. As you can see here in this figure, the results of the systematic literature review do confirm the hypothesis that flood risk reduction is indeed the dominating goal of voluntary property buyouts. The second hypothesis is also confirmed, as we can see that secondary goals are also present and relevant. These other goals and priorities are integral to understanding the full scope of beneficial and adverse outcomes once the buyout has been completed. This next graph shows who is setting the goals, grouped by goal category. It is clear that some level of government, whether that be the local, state, or federal government, but it's usually the local government, is the actor that is most frequently setting the goals of the buyout programs. Property owners and residents are much less frequently involved in setting these goals according to what's recorded in the literature. Now this graph shows who the goals are intended or predicted to impact. The two most frequently impacted actors from literature are the local governments and the property owners and residents. So we also hypothesized that once the buyouts have occurred, outcomes beyond flood risk reduction are important in the perception of outcomes, both beneficial and adverse. So here we can see that the perceived outcomes that were stated or described in the literature, and we can indeed see, we can see all of the perceived outcomes that were stated in the literature, and we definitely see that all 5 categories of outcomes are perceived in the literature. So flood risk reduction is still the dominating category, which is expected, but the other categories are relevant as well. So perceived outcomes falling within the buyout process and implementation, as well as the social and economic categories, are particularly covered in literature at a high frequency. So this next figure shows who perceived the outcomes grouped by outcome category. The outcomes are most frequently perceived by local and federal governments, as well as the researchers through their studies of the buyout program locations. And conversely, this figure shows us who the perceived outcomes actually impact, as stated or described in the literature. So it is clear that local governments in blue and the property owners and residents are the most frequently stated actors that the perceived outcomes impact. All other actors are nearly non-existent in the literature. Renters do pop up in this dark orange right here, as well as emergency responders and prisoners through labor, but they're nearly non-existent in literature. So echoing what Elise was describing, this research also raises some questions about whose stories get told and whose voices get heard before, during, and after the buyout program. As the perceived outcomes were stated or described through the literature, we recorded which perceived outcomes were considered negative or positive. And this figure shows that these two options grouped by perceived outcome, and it appears that the literature largely captures positive perceived outcomes. But what's more interesting is when we look at positive versus negative perceived outcomes grouped by who is perceiving the outcome. Local governments and the researchers who are studying the buyouts perceive positive outcomes about 75% of the time. State governments, 100% of the time, and federal governments perceive positive outcomes almost 100% of the time. Both NGOs and private sector businesses perceive negative outcomes 100% of the time, and property owners perceive outcomes that are negative about 50% of the time. So moving on to the comparative analysis, this map shows all of the locations that FEMA has funded a voluntary property buyout at. There are over 40,000 properties accounted for in this data set. And the size of each circle on the map corresponds to how many properties at each unique location were involved in the project. And just to make this abundantly clear, these properties are from the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Assistance Database. So these do not include any properties acquired through HUD-only funded programs or solely local or state funded programs. So now the map includes bright blue circles that show the same locations that were covered in the systematic literature review. Again, the size of the circle corresponds to how many papers cover each unique location. And so here we can see the direct relationship or the comparison where FEMA buyouts have taken place throughout history and which locations are being picked up by the literature. We can also see that there are many locations that are not picked up for coverage in literature. It can also be seen that the locations covered in literature do seem to be locations with large numbers of properties included in the project, or where many buyout projects seem to take place, where there are clusters of buyout locations. So this next set of maps will emphasize one of the gaps that I mentioned earlier in the literature to date, the renters. So this map shows the subset of FEMA hazard mitigation property locations that are categorized as being rental properties. Again, the size of the circle corresponds to how many rental properties were acquired through the buyout program at each unique location. So something important to note here is that we're not working with full information. Approximately 60% of the entries in the FEMA hazard mitigation data set do not have a specified value for the property type. So the data is missing, so there's no distinction between rental or owner occupied properties. So this map isn't necessarily representative of all FEMA buyouts, but this at least gives us an idea of where and how many rental properties have been acquired to date. So now this map includes 5 points, and I know you might have missed it because there's only 5 points, but along the East Coast here and in Texas. These are the 5 locations in the systematic review that includes some mention of renters or rental properties. So this is visual evidence that how little renters are accounted for in the buyout literature to date. This is particularly concerning when we are considering the requirement of FEMA property buyouts to be voluntary. So renters don't really have a say in whether their property that they're renting is included in a buyout program, therefore increasing the chance that the process is involuntary for them. So there is one more lingering question that we are still planning to answer alongside this analysis, and that is a media analysis of buyout program coverage. So we're interested to see where and what gets media attention as one more perspective on buyout programs and how it differs from what we found in these more academic sources. So that should be about my time. I didn't start my timer on time, but oh, I see my note from Catherine. But thank you so much for listening and stay tuned for more research. So I'll pass back to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I have lots of questions, but we will save audience questions and discussion among all of us for the end. Next, we will turn to Lieke Brackel from Delft University of Technology, and she will be talking about control over one's environment, leveling political capabilities to advance procedural justice in managed retreat. Lieke, go ahead and share your screen. Thank you. And we can't hear you.
All right, so welcome, hi. Welcome to Control Over One's Environment, Leveling Political Capabilities to Advance Procedural Justice in Managed Retreat. I'm a PhD candidate at Delft University of Technology and work together with Udo Pesch and Mielke Doorn on the ethics of climate adaptation. So I have a background in philosophy and water management, and what I will present to you today is based upon a paper for the European Conference on Flood Risk Management. And it's based on ongoing research, and I really look forward to hear your feedback at the end of this presentation. So today I will first situate these climate adaptation conflicts I look at in the Delta, the Dutch Delta, and I look at exposure reduction measure strategies, mostly at involuntary relocations. And the problem statement I have is inequalities in political influence. After I explain that to you, I will propose political capabilities as a potential framework to address the concerns I've encountered in the literature review I did and the first initial exploratory interviews. And I was really intrigued by the previous presentation, how she used photography as well, since I also did that by myself, but didn't realize you could use that well in research as well. So what do I mean with exposure reduction? The IPCC risk framework describes hazard, vulnerability, and exposure as different aspects of climate risk. So you can have measures that focus on exposure reduction are, for example, moving people or infrastructure out of specific geographic areas. A managed retreat is, of course, an example, but you can also look at other reasons for relocation of houses, land use change, coastal realignment. And today I will give brief examples of floodplain restoration and the Room for the River program in the Netherlands. because some involuntary relocations took place there. So the Room for the River program in the Netherlands, it's the Rhine-Meuse Delta. In 30 locations, projects have been completed. The goal was to improve flood safety in an integrated manner with attention to nature restoration and cultural heritage. Important to note is that 2/3 of this country is subject to flood risk, including the economic center, and that there is a strong Dutch Water Act, which allows for expropriation and has mechanisms to secure compensation, although compensation, of course, cannot fully cover the loss people face. And so the first contested bypass I will explain is the one near Vees in Wapenveld. You can see here the water that over 6 farms had to be changed. It's green now, so it's a green river, but 5 houses had to be demolished as well, and it was heavily protested. So even now it's featured as a flagship project of the Room for the River program, but high sums were negotiated for the compensation. And what you can see here is citizens taking part in a theater play at the end of the program, since it's complete now, to mourn the loss of their cherished landscape. And this has had real impact on the community. And this is another example along the same River IJssel, where plans were made for a bypass in combination with residential area development. And the actor coalition, they called themselves Bye Bye Bypass. They were effective to block the plans as they were designed by lobbying and all kinds of political strategies. And in the end, the current plans were blocked, but then they were changed into a different setting. And then it was slightly changed. So only there was small opposition from people near Zwartendijk, but at the moment also this plan is continued. And what triggers me with these examples is how the question like who oppose and who are effective in their opposition and why, and which locations are selected. And also in other research I've done in the Southwestern Delta, talking to farmers, this dimension of politics and seems really relevant. So here is the problem I see is that we must acknowledge that changing a landscape, whether it's man-made or due to climate change, is really prone to conflict. And not all people in the area will agree on the necessity of the measures. And there's disagreement between stakeholders, but also within communities. And these need to be unpacked. And the thing is that within these disagreements in communities almost all over the world, there are inequalities in political influence. So with that, I mean not only participation, but rather the agenda at the agenda setting phase and how people are able to block or stop projects altogether. And it's simply that some people have more time, connections, expertise, and this influences flood risk management. And the focus on procedural justice is justified as well, since we talk about involuntary relocations. And in the literature, this is, and also if you hear the stories from the people involved, this causes a lot of psychological stress. It deals with the loss of self-determination because people are attached to place. And from the philosophical literature, Martha Nussbaum has a notion that's control over your environment, that in a way addresses this, and she says that control over your environment is critical for human happiness and flourishing. So I don't mean to say that relocation should never take place, just really important to realize that they are impactful for the inhabitants. And I aim to develop a framework where we can still secure that sense of control amidst changes that we can anticipate due to climate change, because the Dutch Delta, it's really fixed now, but it's uncertain. Probably things will have to change. And political capabilities helps to address that need for self-determination in changing climate contexts. So behind the capabilities approach are Amartya Sen, Martin Nussbaum, Brina Holland, Ingrid Robijns, David Schlossberg. Brina Holland first applied the notion of political capabilities to the realm of climate adaptation. And to give a definition, capabilities are what people are able to be and to do. And what in philosophy, what it helps to show is that justice is not only about distribution, but also what people are capable of doing with these resources they get. And it's helpful in public policy since it helps to justify additional support for some people, and more recent discussions also include posing limits to the capabilities of others. And capabilities are adaptable to context due to social and environmental conversion factors. That simply means that where you live in the context really depends on what you can do with these resources. And this is also an avenue to integrate concerns of structural injustices or, for example, geographic patterns of misrecognition. And another characteristic is that this notion of control over one's environment is important since it's also flexible. In each situation, we should really listen to the people that live there for what threats and risks actually are, since flooding usually is not the only thing people worry about, and maybe not even the most important. So choosing capabilities, really like this self-determination, is at the core of the capabilities approach. And it focuses on agency rather than on their vulnerability. So you can see that even if people have the capability to stay in a certain location, they can still choose not to do so. And it's also about how different communities can decide for themselves what they deem valuable to protect. And this process of choice by Amartya Sen, it's simply explained by the thought experiment that if you are inside for a full day because you choose to be inside, that's very different than if you are inside for the full day because there's a gunman in front of your door. And it's the same with buyouts. It has been mentioned in this conference frequently, but if you want to be bought out, that's very different than if you are presented with buyouts as the only way out of a dire situation, or if it's just obligatory. So political capabilities are one of the core capabilities identified by Nussbaum to protect. And according to Holland, it's an account of procedural justice that foregrounds the capability for control over one's environment, defined as having the political power to influence adaptation decisions. But there's one problem to the definition, at least from my perspective from the Dutch context, and that's that some actors have too much power to shape adaptation decisions. And now I think about retired, affluent, highly educated people that dominate, mostly men, that dominate participation settings, or powerful lobby groups or individuals that are able to block projects altogether or negotiate compensation sums. And this inequality is also part of bad risk management, not only the empowerment of vulnerable communities. So we propose to look at sufficient political control over your environment as the ideal. And this also includes setting limits and thinking about improving institutions to create more of a level playing field. To summarize, possibilities of political capabilities are that it addresses the value of self-determination, that it's flexible and practical due to its procedural approach, because in reality on the ground, even if people will have disagreements about substantive values, what to prioritize, there are also limitations, and that is how to address other values such as environmental integrity. It may be at high ecological cost if, for example, the Dutch coast, the coastal armoring continues, and resource efficiency, the cost to be bared to stay are bared by a larger community. And there is discussion whether future generations and non-humans can be included in the capabilities approach. Some say they can, others say you need additional framework for it, but this is contested. And finally, who decides what is a level playing field for this situation? I don't want to return to some kind of top-downism, but I still think that small improvements can already be made. For example, in paying more attention at lobbying, not only at invited participation settings, increasing transparency, all that kind of solutions. So finally, areas of application are compensation negotiation, location selection, policy design. This is sort of a tentative research framework I'm in the process of data collection. So I really look at scanning the context for power differences and what people are controlling the environment at this moment and what we can learn from that, anticipating climate impacts. But at least it seems to be able to address grievances I have encountered both in conversations with people and in the literature review. So next year I will be developing this further, focuses the Netherlands with the broader EU outlook, Germany, Belgium, and I'm really interested in the comparative perspective with the UK and the US as well. So if you have experiences with protests against managed retreat or more theoretical feedback on this presentation, I'm more than happy to talk further with you. I think this is important since anticipating climate change impacts in the future, where managed retreat may have to be implemented more often than we would hope. We need to learn how we can at the same time live flexibly in a delta, but still have that sense of political control over your environment for the people affected. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieke. And there are actually two questions, and thank you for leaving time for them. So the first question, I'll read both of them and then just turn it back to you. So how do you balance including community input in buyout programs with the issues of some people having too much power? And then the next question, so yeah, balancing community input and some people having too much power. The next one, is there an ideological dimension to protest? For example, are there examples of people who accepted the necessity of relocation for the greater good?
So how to balance community input and some people, so I'm not going to pretend as if I know this already. This is a question I have myself. So I just think that we can do that better and design ways to listen to different people. I know from participation research that you can try to create these power-free spaces, but I don't think that's really possible. And I'm more interested also in the planning design before community input. So I think community input is critical to make better plans and to know what's going on and to this information you really need it. But when it comes to situations like in the Dutch context where measures are implemented and people really don't want it, but they still are being implemented, then other factors come into play, and maybe even actors that are not part of the official participation process. So you need a wider lens for that. And the second question about the ideological dimension of protests. I think there was a presentation in the other session about how in Germany, people feel like they have created the land. Well, similar cultural mechanisms are at play in the Netherlands, that there's this long history. And I have talked to farmers who said that their grandparents rebuilt land after the 1953 flood and that they really want to protect it and feel like it's a Western thing or like a green hobby to want to move to, for example, retreat or restore delta dynamics. So this is a political issue as well. And therefore, I think we should not, sometimes water management is perceived quite technical in the Netherlands. So I think we should address these political dimensions head on and then see who are more influential in the politics of adaptation.
Yeah, and those politics are increasingly part of the lived experience, not just in the Netherlands, but globally. So thank you so much. Excellent. We will go towards our fourth presentation, which will be by Sara Bohnert from the University of Waterloo, and she will be talking about moving towards a better buyout.
Thank you. Let me share. Oops, I have to actually share my screen first. Sorry, 1 second. There we go. So thank you. I'm Sara Bohnert. Today I'm going to be talking about considering the role of social license in buyout implementation. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that as a Waterloo student, I live, work, and study on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee First Peoples. I also recognize that as experts, you know what a buyout is, but I'm going to throw up a definition on the slide anyways, because although there is a distinction between a buyout and a land acquisition in the United States, in terms of what happens to the land post buyout and whether or not redevelopment is on the table, that's not necessarily the case in Canada. And so I've adopted a definition to define a buyout as a program in which a government purchases an at-risk property, manages the land, and any subsequent redevelopment. And what I was really interested in and fascinated by as I conducted this research was the issue of participation and this idea of softening buyouts to make them easier to implement. The research identifies participation as a limiting factor in buyout implementation, especially considering that most occur post-disaster. And so it suggests that perhaps proactive buyouts are the best way to go. There's also a lot of research that looks on the factors that influence people's willingness to participate in buyouts. And they usually summarize willingness to participate or willingness to accept as kind of the definition that's used most often. But as I conducted my research, was really struggling with this idea of willingness to accept. And I instead chose to use the term social license. Social license is referred to as the ongoing approval of a project by the general public. Applied here, it's the ongoing acceptance of a buyout as a valuable way for that community to reduce its risk associated with flooding and erosion. And the reason, actually, I'm going to go back. The reason I chose to use the term social license is because in defining the process as ongoing, it creates room for people's opinions to change over time, because as we know, buyouts can take as many as 5 years to implement, and the details often change as the project is implemented. And so people's opinions do change over time, unfortunately, sometimes for the worse. So the question I came into this research with was, what factors are important to consider to improve the social license of a proactive buyout program? I predominantly stuck to the literature and conducted a literature review to answer that question, but I also used a case study to test the idea of social license in a real world context where a buyout could be an appropriate solution. And I was fortunate enough to conduct a select number of semi-structured interviews with participants to understand key considerations that would influence social license within the case study context before finally synthesizing all of that information into something that was, like a strategy that could potentially help in that context. So said context is a road called Erie Shore Drive in Chatham-Kent, Ontario in Canada. The road is that little red dot that's on your screen. I recognize this is a really kind of blown out map. The road is home to approximately 150 properties. There is a dike that runs along the road that was implemented in 1910. And then houses began to appear in the 1930s between the shoreline and the dike. So they are not protected by the dike. And as lake levels have risen in the last 10 years, they have unfortunately been exposed to repeated flooding because of the lake levels. And basically, every time a storm comes through, these properties are flooded. In 2019, Chatham-Kent commissioned a shoreline management study to evaluate potential solutions to mitigate flooding in this area and other areas within the municipality. 4 recommendations were proposed in that study, with the best management practice being to naturalize the entire area following a buyout and dike removal. This was the best long-term strategy, but unfortunately, before the recommendations could be even proposed to the public, a series of significant storms destabilized the dike to the point where Chatham-Kent had to declare an emergency, evacuate residents, and then conduct emergency repairs on the dike. They did that in 2019, but in March of 2020 decided that it was still too dangerous, and so they permanently closed the road using a bylaw. This affected 124 properties, including 40 full-time residents. And as of March of 2021, the municipality has decided not to proceed with a buyout, even though that was the best option. They did so because they felt that they had the lack of financial resources. They had no political support from council, and there was also no political or economic support from the Ontario provincial government. And that said, Residents who came to the shoreline management meetings and who talked to municipal officials throughout this entire process were still asking about buyouts. Some even suggested in comments that by not fully considering the benefits of buyouts, the community had missed an opportunity to reduce risk. And so it seems that buyouts still remain a viable option and still have social license in the community. So I kept going with the case study, even though buyout wasn't the at present thing that they were going to do. And I still asked the question, what factors are important to consider to improve the social license of a buyout program? In talking with community members and in looking at the literature, everyone seems to suggest that the reasons that people accept or refuse a buyout offer vary across space and time and between people. But along Erie Shore Drive, participants identified emotional attachment to place as a significant driver. Many properties have been owned by one family who've inhabited that house for like 70 years. And so they have a real desire to remain in place, to pass the house on, even in the face of significant flood damage. And so overcoming emotional attachment with some sort of strategy and communication will be key to a buyout. But as part of attachment, price is also important to consider, or even return on investment, because generally houses make up a good chunk of people's financial capital. On top of that, in Erie Shore Drive, we also have to consider the fact that people have repaired flood damage, and they've also maintained flood mitigation structures, as you saw in the previous slide. And on top of that, we also have to consider that Erie Shore Drive is some of the cheapest waterside property in Southern Ontario. So simply put, many of these property owners likely cannot afford to leave. And that's a significant driver for staying and for a buyout not having social license. As well, over the course of the research, it became very evident that there are significant tensions between property owners and municipal officials, and a conflict over who is responsible for risk reduction. Property owners believe that the municipality has a responsibility to save them, whereas the municipality feels that property owners should be partly responsible because they chose to live there. And so addressing that emotional and political baggage will be the first thing that needs to be done. So the strategies that can be used to kind of address this context and ensure social license are varied. There are many approaches that could be taken. The 5 strategies that kind of came out of my research were being aware of context, having a dialogue, communicating well and being consistent in communication, having a rationale, and having co-benefits. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about 3 of them. Early and ongoing and transparent dialogue is crucial for facilitating trust. Because most buyouts are reactive and they're implemented kind of like ad hoc, the details tend to change over time. And if this isn't communicated properly and property owners aren't given opportunities to voice their perceptions and experiences, at best, they feel unheard, and at worst, they begin to lose trust in the program. In terms of Erie Shore Drive, we're already seeing how a lack of good communication has eroded trust. Multiple participants and residents in media interviews have said things like, they never listen to us, they never tell us anything. And so that has contributed to a sense of frustration and not wanting to work together. And all of this suggests going forward that in any sort of proactive buyout setting, you need to proactively plan for opportunities to have dialogue. So residents mentioned things like mentoring programs, or potentially having central information hubs where people can come together and have a conversation and actually meet somebody face to face. And in that way, you can hopefully begin to have a human connection with somebody and facilitate a meaningful dialogue. In combination with consistent communication, though, there needs to be a way to provide specific and justifiable rationale for decision-making in order to maintain transparency. Participants in this study really emphasize the need for rationale because there are so many areas within the municipality that have water issues. One participant said something like, it would open the checkbook for every other place with water problems. And so that suggests that the rationale perhaps hopefully could be bottom up instead of top down. You know, the decisions are made collaboratively, but even if they are made by the council, they need to be objective and they need to be publicly accessible. Because when they are not objective, when they are not publicly accessible, you know, you lose accountability, and then there are perceptions, the literature suggests that it seems to become unfair in the eyes of the public, which erodes trust. And the last thing I want to touch on, it's related to this idea of justifying the cost or the decisions that are made, and that's the idea of co-benefits. But because buyouts are geographically bounded, they only directly benefit a small number of people. And yet, as we've seen in Elise's study today, they still have a huge impact on other communities in the area. And so this can create or exacerbate tensions amongst residents in other neighborhoods, as I saw in Chatham, Kent. One participant quoted a property owner who lived somewhere else in the municipality, and that person said, when the weather and the lake were good, those people on Erie Shore Drive never invited me to a barbecue, but now that the lake is bad, they expect me to help to pay for them to leave. And so I think really communicating the potential benefits beyond risk reduction to property owners and to counselors is a really, really important way to ensure that a buyout has social license. These co-benefits can include, you know, wind and wave buffering through naturalization, improved erosion rates, so that protects down current communities, as well as reintroducing natural species or native species. It can also include things like recreational benefits. On Erie Shore Drive, there is an existing trail system that could be extended so people in the community can enjoy this area once it's been bought out. Importantly for the municipality as well, there are potential economic savings. I understand that a buyout is incredibly expensive. For Erie Shore Drive, the cost at tax assessed value alone is approximately $20 million. That's a lot of money that the municipality doesn't necessarily have, but it could also be, that cost could be offset in the long term through, for example, removing the dike so you no longer have to repair and maintain it. Could also potentially be recovered through reduced municipal servicing for water and wastewater, or even not having the road, so not having to maintain the road anymore. But what's really needed to ensure that co-benefits are perceived and distributed is a dedication to looking at long-term planning, full cost accounting that accounts for more than just the short-term implementation costs, and also that dedication to communication and to collaboratively working with everybody to ensure that everybody has an understanding of what's going on and everybody benefits. So in conclusion, some parting thoughts. You know, researchers suggest that proactive buyouts offer opportunities to increase participation and efficacy, but that said, they still need to have social license or the ongoing approval from the community. The factors that influence social license are varied, but consistent communication, trust building, justifying the decisions that you've made publicly, and then ensuring that there are co-benefits can help ensure that the program is consistent, it's fair, and it's helpful. On top of that, proactive buyouts have to be integrated with a more holistic and long-term land use and climate change adaptation strategy in order to work in the long term. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. And you left time for a question, so I will go ahead and throw one out. When you take this important angle on social license, what do you think is most unique about a buyout as compared to other public policies in shaping whether that social license exists, or in shaping the lessons that you unfolded at the end? Like, what do we need to put at the top of our radar for buyouts?
I think buyouts are, that's a very difficult question to answer. I think buyouts are most unique, well, because they involve people leaving, right? And so there's that emotional attachment. There's emotional attachment to place that if you were to adapt or avoid in the first place, avoid these areas, you wouldn't have to overcome. And so just ensuring that the human face is still on the forefront of coordinators' minds is unique to ensuring that there is social license. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, wonderful. And I agree, it could be a very long discussion, such an important angle on buyouts. Excellent. We will push on to our last presentation from the session, which will be by Eva Maples, really drawing some important connections in highlighting best practices for voluntary buyout programs.
Thank you very much. We appreciate this opportunity to speak today. I'm going to share screen real quick. Please let me know if you can see this. Okay. Okay. I'm presenting today on behalf of my colleague, Steve Mollica. He sends his apologies. He had a family emergency. So I work very closely with Steve. We work in the aviation industry. We also work with buyouts on disaster recovery programs, but primarily today we wanted to speak with you about some of the lessons we've learned working with airport noise mitigation and implementing the Uniform Act, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. The Uniform Act is used in buyout programs, but maybe to a little bit of more limited capacity. So today we wanted to just speak with you about our experiences with relocating homeowners for noise mitigation, and particularly voluntary relocation programs overseen by the Federal Aviation Department. Sorry. Okay. All right. I'm sorry, next screen. Okay, so what we saw was marked similarities between moving people who are adversely impacted by noise and the problem of moving those people, similar to with climate change and flooding. We're seeing on scale similar to where airport noise was in the 70s. I'm gonna go back. So you'll see this graph here shows just a very basic depiction of air flight increasing over the last few decades. This was due to deregulation and other factors, people having a better buying power and so forth and being able to fly. So an obvious result of increased air travel is a corresponding increase in people that are living and working in near airports and being subjected to noise levels that created unattainable and unsafe living conditions. And similar to climate change, we are seeing more people living and working areas where flooding risk is increasing, also resulting in unsafe living conditions. In the 1970s, studies were finding about 7 million people living near airports that were having subjected to airport noise that was higher than 70 decibels, which is like running a vacuum cleaner or your garbage disposal at all times. By 2012, the number decreased to about 300,000 people. So, what was done to address this problem and what led to this decrease? So in the 1970s, there was an Aviation Safety and Noise Mitigation Act passed. And what this did was it enabled to create a framework for relocation that was proactive in an equitable manner for property owners that were, in the path of the noise contours. It established protocols for relocation, and it opened up the door for funding and issuance of grants that is overseen by the FAA even today. And most importantly, the use of the Federal Uniform Relocation Act of 1970s, which is intended to provide for equitable, fair treatment of all people that are being relocated that are in the path of air noise. Excuse me. Similarly, with buyout programs, we are seeing Uniform Act also being implemented, but in the limited capacity, it actually creates confusion for sponsors and for homeowners. We have seen the Uniform Act be implemented on a smaller scale with airport programs very effectively, but we do see that you need to implement the full Uniform Act and not in a limited capacity. So some of the key components of the Uniform Act that are implemented is, of course, requiring that the agency provide or assure that the replacement housing is DSS decent, safe, and sanitary. And this is actually implemented in the buyout program. But I wanted to point out one of the things that we see, and I know our fellow speakers have pointed on this, is the participants in buyout programs are not always able to afford to move. And so we do see that it's important to implement the full relocation housing payment aspect of the Uniform Act. And that actually helps homeowners to realize moving into areas that are either the same or better in their buying power. So to summarize and to conclude, we see the opportunity to create long-term proactive buyout programs utilizing the full Uniform Act in a very similar manner as the FAA has created for airport noise mitigation. Noise mitigation programs are planned long-term. They're usually in a full contour of noise and also voluntary, and most importantly, utilizing the full Uniform Act. So that was a very short presentation, but I hope that it was informative, and I welcome any questions anyone has.
Thank you, Eva. That was totally to the point. I think there are a lot more themes we probably want to draw out there with regard to the Uniform Relocation Act and transferring these lessons. What I might say is thank you for ending early, because that means we now have tons of time for our discussion together. So what if we go ahead and shift to everyone having camera on? And hopefully Matthew will make it so that we all pop onto the screen. So I'll pose a question here that is building from what we've got in the chat already. And Eva, you can go ahead and kick off, but I suspect others will have inputs as well. And so, whether it's Lake Erie or drawing lessons from airport-related relocations, for a buyout process, what do we know right now about the most important features to ensure that it is a consistent, fair, and helpful process? Giant question, but maybe each one of you could just give your greatest lesson for a consistent, fair, helpful process. And Eva, starting with you.
So again, staying to the Uniform Act, it provides your framework for approaching homeowners. It's important that you treat them the same across the board, and that you actually are sensitive to this. It's a pretty daunting task to actually relocate. Guiding them through the entire process, and helping them realize that that they are eligible for and protected through this federal act and able to relocate and even better their living situation. In the buyout program that I am working on right now, the only thing that I see that's really missing is people do not have the ability to. Usually you're finding, first of all, it's the programs take a long time to get up and running. So you really need to have someone who is an expert in the Uniform Act to help the sponsor develop the program. And then you also need to be able to hit the ground running to help this person, because they've probably been sitting for 2 or 3 years waiting on this project. And so their buying power has been greatly diminished, either facing foreclosure or any kind of other stresses that are involved in the process. So just knowing the Uniform Act, knowing how to implement it, helping them find comparable housing, and being able to have that full purchasing power. And if I could just add real quick, when I say replacement housing payment, and everyone may already be familiar with this, but replacement housing payment is that gap beyond either pre-disaster or post-disaster value of what the real estate is selling for today. So that, I think that is a key aspect, is supporting their ability to purchase in today's market. I hope that's helps. I see nods.
Yeah, and there's so many reasons why pre-disaster value based on certain communities or the experience may simply not be enough. So I think really excellent points to highlight there. Anyone else want to highlight a key theme there? We also have a whole series of questions coming if people prefer to hop on to the next one as well.
I guess I can share one from my extensive literature review. I can tell you so many things that lead to a beneficial buyout, but several of these presentations have already touched on many of them. But I think the number one key factor that leads to a successful buyout is community engagement and interactions from the beginning, before it even becomes a program, before it's even really established. And one of these papers, it emphasizes that buyouts are highly disruptive, whether it ends up being beneficial in the long run to the homeowners. There's a certain amount of loss that happens, even if it does end up being a good thing in the long run. So many of these papers have the same theme, that involving residents from the beginning, it avoids a lot of mistrust and misinformation along the line.
Agree.
Cool. Okay, I might suggest that we hop to a next question, since we've got a long lineup of them here. This one may be most directed at Elise, although I'm guessing several of you may have thought about it. So when we think about the landscapes and neighborhoods where buyouts have taken place, what is most similar or different as compared to a neighborhood where there are vacant lots for other reasons, whether it's degrowth, depopulation, disrepair, underinvestment, you name it?
Yes, so a lot of reasons cause vacant lots, right? There's economic reasons, there's buyouts. I think something that's interesting around the utility of the land post-buyout and the utility of the open space, it does depend on how much the community wants to invest. And so there's parallels there between disinvestment of urban spaces, parallels over historic and systematic policies that have prevented resources from flowing through, particularly communities of color. So then when we start to think about that in parallels to buyouts, some questions we're currently, I didn't present this here, but some questions we're currently thinking about is, how does utility of open space reflect back to the demographics of the neighborhoods and the political capital of those in the peripheral communities? So far, the work is showing that, and probably not surprising, there's a more investment in more white, wealthier communities. We tend to see more parks there, higher utility land uses in those locations compared to areas that are more predominantly either minority majority communities or communities of color. And so I think that parallels what we see in any form of urban development in terms of land use and investment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so many of the challenges for returning to a more equitable circumstance now with buyouts in the mix as well. Okay, I'm going to merge two of the questions for our next question set here, and this really will span countries. So I'm hoping we can start to compare Canada, the US, and the Netherlands perhaps. So building from the theme of social license, but potentially going beyond the concept as well, how can community groups or governments better communicate the benefits of buyouts? And related to that, where we know that there are powerful facilitation tools and skills that are relevant to engagement, especially where power dynamics are relevant, what could we be applying from other realms with regard to facilitation, school tools and skills in the context of buyouts, recognizing that those who may be best applying those facilitation skills may not be the academics, but more also in that space of community groups or government? Too big of a question?
If I can just jump into the second point about how to potentially use those existing resources that may not be in the realm of government. I feel like, at least in the Irishwood Drive context, the municipality just didn't know what resources were out there. They were very much going with a path dependency or status quo way of doing things in terms of if the opportunities weren't in their immediate line of sight, they didn't know they were there. So I hope perhaps that would be the realm of academics or the public sector or private companies sorry, not public sector, NGOs to perhaps jump in and say to municipalities they're working with, hey, there are XY tools available to help facilitate conversations around buyouts. Here are some public engagement tools and here's how you use them. And hopefully in that way can kind of begin to break those blinkers that the municipalities have on.
Okay, our next set of questions relates to Fema buyouts in particular, and I know we have at least 3 of us in the room who have thought way too much about the full scope of Fema buyout. So I'll just give a little bit of background and then open this really to Elise and Jennifer. So how far back do Fema buyouts go? As many of us know, they started in 1989 for the most part and have occurred under a whole suite of relevant programs through time, especially HMGP. And the question here is really what's being studied and what isn't being studied. And I'll just give the stats at the top of my head. There are 100 countries across the United States counties across the United States where at least 100 buyouts have occurred, although the median number of buyouts in any given county is 10. So across that landscape, 40,000 buyouts over the last few decades, largely these tiny little projects. What's being studied, what isn't, and Elyse is one of the few people who has actually gone out there and studied vast numbers of these. Maybe starting with you on any reflections of what do we know, what don't we know about how this large set of buyouts has gone?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, as we need to understand as a field what we don't know. It's been great to see so many new voices and perspectives coming into the research in the past few years. So we're getting better exposure on what we don't know. And I really appreciate, Jennifer, the thoughtfulness of kind of the geographic distribution and the reality, as you mentioned, Catherine, so many are in small communities, or it's a pocket here, it's a handful here. And so we have a lot of case studies. And so case studies are useful. It tells us about that local experience. I do a lot of case study work. I'll be the first to highlight that importance, but not all case studies are going to be generalizable. And to Jennifer's research on where the research is happening versus where buyouts are happening, one thing that struck me with that map, and I've played around with some similar things, is also where us researchers are located. So it's very easy for me to drive to a buyout in my city or a couple hours away and study it and do that intensive case study. Other reasons it's more difficult to necessarily pop into a town where there's been 5 and to do the same type of research. So I think there's a misrepresentation, and that's contributed to how we perceive and understand buyouts to this point in the US. And I think we're starting to see more conversations around equity, around those historical experiences. And I think we need more, and we need more from different perspectives and from people who aren't coming at it from the traditional academic backgrounds. So I'll just leave there.
Yeah, wonderful. And Jennifer, we'll turn to you in just 1 millisecond, but a helpful entry into the chat that I was reeling off acronyms without defining them. So FEMA would be the US Federal Emergency Management Agency, for those of you not based in the US. And that HMGP acronym is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, one of the biggest grant programs that exist, where it's largely local governments doing the implementation, although much of the funding is federal. Jennifer, do you want to pick up this theme of, where are we studying buyouts versus where we aren't? What does that imply for what we know? You highlighted the renter theme, which is so powerful, but what else is being missed in current approaches to research?
No, I think Elise summed it up really, really well, that we have a bunch of case studies which are really informative and important to be studying, but as she said, they might not be really representative of all the buyouts happening in the country. And so I guess some biggest gaps that I saw geographically speaking, Florida does not have a lot of cases covered. There are clusters of buyouts happening in Washington and California that have some literature, just not a lot of literature. As you can see on my maps, most of the literature really does cover like the eastern half of the United States. But I guess instead of geographically speaking, it's more of the actors of who is being studied, as I mentioned with the renters, who is actually getting their voices heard. And it is incredibly difficult to get the stories of these people, especially after the fact, figuring out where they have gone, if they are no longer in that city, maybe they've moved several states away. So it is incredibly challenging to hear these stories, but it is definitely a large gap that we have right now of hearing from those renters.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. And I think one extension here that's going to leap over to the Netherlands in 1 millisecond would be that one of our colleagues, Miyuki Hino at the University of North Carolina, has been developing a measure of which communities and how much are communities developing in the floodplain versus safer locations. And one of the implications of her work is that, kind of to the point that Elise and Jennifer made, we tend to have a few of these cases that we know much better than others, oftentimes in the more urban locations. But what Miyuki's work is suggesting is that many of the places where development in floodplains is being avoided in the first place, you don't have a need for retreat. And places that may be pulling development out of the floodplain may or may not be calling it retreat. And Lieke, something I've heard from a number of Dutch colleagues is, well, we don't call it retreat. Why would you call it retreat? And could you just kind of speak to the diversity of approaches? And is there a problem in labeling this as retreat in terms of having it be something for which there is a social license, to connect to Sarah's point as well?
Yeah, I think there is a social license to retreat. Yeah, probably. So I don't want to reiterate too much, but that's due to a history of maybe it is contested. Personally, I'm quite critical of that history, but it's a history of men conquering nature and advancing in the sea, literally. So the saying that apparently is also in German a thing. It's like saying how from 1800 already, how God made land, but the Dutch made the Netherlands, and that's very strong, and it's very much a part of Dutch identity. So there's this can-do feeling. So the thing I've been wondering about with retreat is that here often there seems to be this dichotomy between unmanaged and managed retreat. Also, we saw it in cases, but then in Netherlands, it seems to be advance or stay put. And it's why would you retreat? That's an active decision. This unmanaged retreat, also people perceive that's not an option or it won't occur. And you can also see it as being disconnected from delta dynamics or overconfident in abilities. Personally, I'm not sure, but when you live here, you get that feeling. And then when there are so many plans being made to actually advance into the North Sea, then retreat is part of a more focus on ecology and restoring river dynamics and restoring fish migration and transition zones between, but that's all ecology. So. And then that's not if you look at the political reality in the Netherlands, different interests get prioritized. So.
Yeah, fisheries, not retreat. Very different way of thinking about potentially the same legal mechanism. Wonderful. So where we'll leave it is just giving each one of you a last opportunity to give us one parting reflection, 30 seconds each, super short, but it'd be nice to hear from each of you. And Lieke, let's start with you.
Well, just to clarify, it's not only the fishery thing. I do think we have dike reinforcements, for example. Also, what I told you about with the floodplains, that's climate-related relocation in a way, because we need these dike reinforcements and we will need them in the future. And I personally think there will be examples of, I called it exposure reduction, but you can also see it as forms of managed retreat, where individual farms or houses or perhaps larger settlements will have to move. So it's not only the fish, it's just not very, very top of mind yet. So now we can go to the next one.
Yes, well appreciated. And I didn't mean to oversimplify. Thank you, Lieke. Perfect. Excellent. Eva, do you want to go next?
This has just been very informative for us, and that from our experience, we've had the pleasure of working in very proactive long-term planning, executions of relocation. So we hope that maybe we can help with designing policy to implement those same kind of programs for buyouts. And though that may be naive, everything that everyone has touched on as far as people being emotionally connected to their land, the need for equitable treatment, and the need for buying power we run into on a daily basis. So this has been very, very informative.
Yeah, and your expertise in making it happen is absolutely critical. So thank you, Eva. Sara, over to you.
I just wanted to say thanks so much for the opportunity. It was lovely to hear from everybody, and I've learned so much. Yeah, that's it for me.
Sara and Jennifer.
Yeah, I think this whole conference, and including this session, has been so inspiring and motivating. I think to us as researchers to really dig deep into uncovering these unheard voices and making sure that we really push forward to making sure that these voices are heard. And it's amazing that these researchers in this session, no less, are really working hard on that.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Elyse, we'll give you the last word.
Pressure.
No pressure.
I just wanted to say how exciting it's been to hear all the new and emerging research and how much it's focused on some of these really pressing societal issues that are being magnified through buyouts. And so for me, the whole conference and this session, it's been so exciting to see how quickly the research landscape has changed in this area, because now it's a point where I get notifications and I have to keep looking up stuff, and it's changing regularly. And I can remember just trying to find anything on the topic years ago. So I really enjoyed all the presentations here. I was just so excited to be a part of this.
Thank you. And thank you, Elyse, Lieke, Sara, Eva, Jennifer, and all of you for listening. Really a wonderful way to do our last formal session before the closing events today. So thank you all.
Thank you.